Good afternoon, everybody. It's Renee Bitoon here from Sydney, and I'd like to start off by thanking Kevin Price very much for organising this very interesting connection we have with New Zealand, and this is our first international presenter, and I'm very pleased to present or to introduce you to Rodrigo Ramalho, who is going to introduce himself a little bit about his background, but you can see he's a doctor and you can see he has a PhD. He's going to tell you a little bit more about his work and his background. The topic today is the naturalisation of non-smoking, which is a very unique and interesting presentation. I would like to let you know that it is being recorded. This presentation is being recorded for those who may have to run away or may want to invite their colleagues and friends to have a look at this recording. We will post the connections during the next few days after this. So without further ado, Rodrigo, I'd very much like to propose that you give us a little bit about your background and then go ahead and give us a talk on what's going to be a very interesting topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renee, for that introduction. Like you mentioned, my name is Rodrigo Ramalho, but please call me Rama. I'm a psychiatrist. That's my professional background. I'm currently teaching here in a postgraduate diploma in alcohol and other drugs studies. I just finished my PhD. Well, I just officially finished my PhD. My graduation was a month ago, I think. So that's exactly what I want to share with you, the results from the research that I conducted as part of my PhD. And well, basically, as the title says, I am going to talk to you about this theory that I developed in my research, which I call the naturalization theory of non-smoking. And let me see if I can, there it is. This is how I structured this presentation. For the first I would say half, almost 2/3 of it, I'm going to be talking about how I developed the theory. And hopefully the presentation of how I developed the theory is going to introduce you to some of the key concepts of the theory. So by the time I get to talk about the developed theory itself, I won't need that much time, and it's going to be just some key points that I'm going to address at that stage. And then I'm going to close my presentation with a brief discussion that, more than a discussion, is me bringing up some questions and some ideas. And I would like to hear, or better said, I would like to read what you think about those things. So moving on with the presentation. Basically, this is the short answer to how I developed the theory. I use this methodology called constructivist grounded theory. The idea with the grounded theory research is that through your research, you try to come up with an explanation for the phenomenon that you are studying. You are looking at this phenomenon and you're trying to see if there is a common process, if there is something happening there that could help you to explain how that phenomenon expresses in every situation. Basically, the question that you want to answer is, what is happening here? And the answer that you come up mimics a story, as would any answer to the question, what is happening here would be. What is happening here? Well, what happens here is first this thing, then this other thing, and at the end we end up with this end result. And that's basically my theory. It's almost a story, the story of what happens when someone becomes a non-smoker. And to talk a little bit about the methodology, because I think it's going to be useful. A grounded theory is basically a qualitative research methodology that, through simultaneous data collection or data generation, I prefer the term data generation, allows researchers to develop this theory from the bottom up, from the ground up. And those are the two main characteristics of a grounded theory. First, this simultaneous data collection and analysis, which is uncommon in most research methodologies, because usually you would first collect your data and then you would analyze it. In a grounded theory study, you do these two things simultaneously, and one is informing the other. Your data collection guides your analysis, and your analysis guides your data collection. And you are building a theory from the bottom up, from the ground up, from the data, instead of bringing into the field an already developed theory. What you bring to the field is more a question than a potential explanation or a hypothesis. You bring the question, what is happening here? And I won't go into too much detail on the steps that you go through when using this methodology, but basically what you do is you first collect some data, let's say, as it was in my research, through an interview. So you collect, you do an interview, you generate your data with that interaction that you have with your research participant. In my case, that was audio recorded and then transcribed. What you do with your transcription is you go through a first stage of what is called initial coding. You break up your data in the smallest pieces just to have a feeling of nuances that you might otherwise lose if you look at it as a whole. And all through this process, you are writing down your ideas, your hunches, your feelings, your questions in what is called a memo writing, which is another important analytical tool of the methodology. So everything is registered, and every decision that you make is registered. So you have a trail of everything that happened during your research. And you're always comparing your data. Let's say, for example, after your first interview, you are comparing something that was said early on with something that was said later on. You're comparing a code that you developed with the actual data. And after your second, third, and so on interviews, you're comparing one interview with another, one code with another, and so on. So you're always looking at the data both as a whole and in individual breakdown parts, trying to have a feeling of the nuances and the things that are happening there. During this process, you come up with questions and you come up with potential explanations, with actual hypotheses that are developed in the field rather than before going into your research. And the way in which you test these feelings, these hypotheses, these potential explanations that you're coming up with is through further data collection in what is called a theoretical sampling. So you're now collecting data, you're sampling data, guided by your developing theory. And this new data provides you with something more to compare your potential explanation with, to test it. And you keep doing this until you feel that you were able to come up with certain key categories or concepts that explain your whole data. And once you connect these concepts and among themselves, you end up with a grounded theory. And basically a theory then would be this interrelationships of concepts that systematically explain the phenomenon that you were studying. So an important thing to do, because you don't want to impose anything into your analysis of the data, you want to keep your assumptions in check. You want to keep your already obtained knowledge through readings or through your professional background. You want to keep that in check to prioritize whatever comes up from the data, whatever your participants say, instead of that previously acquired knowledge. And a way of doing that is, for example, writing a memo that records your assumptions before you begin your research. And this is not an actual memo, but it is a representation of a memo that I wrote before embarking on the research process. And this is based on my own experience, which is something that actually led me to be interested in developing this research. I am originally from Paraguay, and I used to be a smoker myself for around 15 years. I started when I was 15, I think, 14, and I continued smoking all through med school or through my training as a psychiatrist, and even during the first months that I was here in New Zealand. And through all that time, I tried to give up smoking thousands of times, but without success. But then there was something interesting that happened when I was here in New Zealand. After a few months in the country, I gave it another go, and I managed to do it. And it was quite a straightforward process. I wouldn't say easy, but yeah, I wouldn't feel I'm lying when I'm saying that it was almost easy that time. And that surprised me a lot. So my assumption was that my coming to New Zealand had a lot to do with the success of that last attempt to quit smoking. And that one's context then, if I were to translate that into something that could be applied for other people, that one's context plays a very relevant role in one's process of giving up smoking, in one's smoking cessation. So that was the assumption that I was basically bringing into my research based on my own experience. And like I mentioned, at the beginning of the research, the main question and the question that the leading question all throughout the research was this one of what is happening here, which is the leading question in all grounded theory researches. But at the beginning, I thought it might be useful to have another extra set of initial questions that would help me to kick off my analysis, not to start with something as broad as what's happening here, but something that would provide me with some sort of guidance. And so I came up with these three initial questions that helped me during the initial stages of the research. What is happening in a successful quit attempt was basically the translation of the question, what is happening here, to make it more applied to the phenomenon that I was studying. I added, what role does the social context play in a successful quit attempt? Because that's something that I wanted to know, and in fact, it was an important part of the research. And an extra question that came from the notion that knowing about the harms of smoking is basically the main drive for people to give up smoking. I added this extra question: what role does knowing about the harm of smoking play in smoking cessation? This initial set of three questions guided the way in which the inclusion criteria were set. The question, who is better suited to provide rich information, was answered in this way. I thought that people who started to smoke in a different context and then gave up smoking in a different context, to talk to people that went through that process would make it easier to see the influence of such context in the process of giving up smoking. So the inclusion criteria, being a migrant who started to smoke in a country different from New Zealand and then gave up smoking in New Zealand, was added there. And of course, I wanted to talk to people that went through the process of actual giving up smoking. And I thought one of the assumptions that I had was that health professionals would probably be the people that I could count on knowing what the harms of smoking are. So they would be the ones that would be better equipped to inform me about the role that knowledge played in their smoking cessation. And I didn't realize, it was only after I began the research process that I realized how narrowed these inclusion criteria were. And I got a bit scared at the beginning because I thought, who will meet this inclusion criteria? But I was lucky though, and I had 14 people raising their hands and accepting to participate in the research. And I would like to express my gratitude to all 14 of them. And at this stage, I would also like to acknowledge Peter Adams, Peter Haggard, and Karen, who contributed to my research hugely in the role of supervisors. But coming back to the research, the way I'm going to talk about it, because it would be difficult to talk about it in the way in which it actually went, I'm going to talk about it as if I had collected all the data first and then analyze it, instead of how it actually went, which was collecting data, analyzing, collecting part of data, analyzing, and so on, which would make the story a bit cumbersome. So I'm going to go at it as if I had collected all the data first and then analyzed it. But something that I do want to mention is my first interview. My first interview was with James, which is a pseudonym. And James' story of giving up smoking was one very different to the one that I had. He came to New Zealand and he found himself in New Zealand surrounded by smokers, which was the opposite of my experience. My experience of coming to New Zealand was one of finding myself all of a sudden surrounded by non-smokers. His experience was the opposite. He quit smoking in New Zealand, though, right before leaving to another country from where he eventually came back. But that threw me off. And it was great in a way, because it forced me to be mindful that I should prioritize participants' stories rather than my assumptions. And it helped me to remain in check all throughout the research. But that wasn't only the one thing that made it hard at the beginning to find commonalities, and this common process. My process and the one from James were very different. Although, and yes, I have to admit, I had it in the background of my head, in my head. But that wasn't the only difference. There were participants who came to New Zealand and gave up smoking shortly after coming to the country. There were participants who came to New Zealand and continued to smoke for years and even decades in the country before giving up smoking. Most participants had a previous quit attempt, but there was one participant who didn't have a previous quit attempt. So it was at the beginning kind of hard to find that common process. I couldn't say anymore that coming to New Zealand was the thing that triggered smoking cessation for everybody, because that was not the case for everybody. I couldn't also say that it was having numerous quit attempts before you that would provide you at one point with the expertise to succeed in the lasting successful one, because there was a participant who didn't have any previous quit attempt. So it was hard and it was fun. But even more, I couldn't find a common strategy that was used by all participants that would help me to say, oh, okay, this is what you need to do in order to successfully give up smoking. Because all participants used different strategies. Some participants did the same thing they did in their previous attempts, and this time it worked. Some participants did something very different, and it worked. For some participants, their attempt to quit smoking began only once they stopped smoking. They made the decision to stop smoking and immediately throw their cigarettes, or again, just to further exemplify the differences of experience, some participants decided to give up smoking and get rid of their cigarettes. Others decided to give up smoking and kept their package of cigarettes with them, because they thought, okay, if I get rid of them, I probably end up with the desire to buy more, so I better keep it there. That's going to help me to manage the desire to smoke. For other participants, actually, the decision was followed by a time of planning how they were going to move on to the actual attempt. But again, the attempt began only once they stopped smoking, and they stick to the plan, and it worked. But there were also participants whose attempt to quit smoking also included actual smoking, whether it was because they were reducing the amount of cigarettes that they were smoking until reaching zero, or because it was part of the advice that they were given by medical doctors when they were prescribed medication that they used in the last and successful attempt, which worked. So as Tom said, essentially we always have to do these things our own way, and there were various ways in which this thing was done. So I was indeed struggling with finding that common story, that common process, in that process of giving up smoking. So there was nevertheless this one thing that was common among all participants, and it was a mentioning that context was relevant. All participants agreed in that context was relevant to the success of their attempt. And there are some examples here. Alex, who mentioned that it happened really naturally to him there, so he became a non-smoker. And the first thing that comes to mind is the environment. And the same thing with Peter, emphasizing that it doesn't only play an important role in quitting, but it also plays an important role in beginning to smoke. And this led me to what I would call my first aha moment, which is going back to all my data. I realized that all participants were actually talking a lot about their previous smoking during our interviews. At first, I thought that this was just an interesting way of beginning the story. I used to smoke, and then this thing happened, and I gave up smoking. But then I realized what they were doing is actually setting setting a background, describing to me the context in which they used to smoke, so that they could then describe the context in which they became non-smokers, and by contrasting these two. So I used to smoke in a place where there was a lot of smoking, everybody smoked, all my friends were smokers. And I became a non-smoker in a context where almost nobody smoked, where there wasn't a lot of smoking around, and all of my friends were non-smokers. So they experienced these two different contexts, and the one where non-smoking was more prevalent was indeed very relevant to their processes of becoming non-smokers. By the way, what I mean by context is something like what Chloe said here. Practically everything that surrounds you, buildings, costumes, people, relationships, everything that is around you and nurtures yourself and your social life. But I had to do something. I couldn't anymore say that social context and New Zealand were the same thing. So I had to revise that assumption that I brought into my research. And because not all participants came to New Zealand and found themselves in a context that was the same for everybody. Some participants found themselves in a place where there were a lot of smokers. Some participants found themselves in a place where there were a lot of non-smokers. So I had to no longer call New Zealand the social context. So what I did instead was I came up with this other way of referring to these two contrasting contexts. I labeled them a smoking milieu and a non-smoking milieu. Like I mentioned, a smoking milieu was drawing from how participants described it, a place where smoking was normal, a place where smoking was ever present, where everybody smoked, where nobody would ask you why you are smoking, why are you smoking. It was also a place where they interacted a lot with other smokers. A non-smoking milieu, on the contrary, was a place where non-smoking was the most present thing. Nobody smoked. And if you smoked in such a milieu, people would ask you, like, what are you doing? Because the taken for granted behavior was non-smoking. And all of their friends, or most of their interactions were with non-smokers. And while most participants found themselves interacting with a non-smoking milieu after they came to New Zealand, there were some participants who, after they came to New Zealand, they found themselves in a smoking milieu instead. But still, all participants, including those who first interacted with a smoking milieu, at one point shifted to a non-smoking milieu, so that all participants at one point found themselves interacting with this non-smoking milieu. And that was the difference. First of all, that was the thing that they all shared. And that was the one thing that was different from all their previous quit attempts. They didn't have the chance before, the chance to interact with a non-smoking milieu. But that context wasn't always very useful to the process of giving up smoking. For example, there were participants who came to New Zealand and found themselves interacting with smoking milieus. They were surrounded by smokers, like James described it, and they gave up smoking in those contexts. So to them, the context wasn't at all very helpful to their process of giving up smoking. And like Alex described it in regard to his previous attempts, it was more like a struggle than a liberation. Tanya emphasized the social aspects of the social struggle that comes with giving up smoking. People don't know about the social implications. He would talk about how it changes the social dynamics. You cannot interact with your friends who smoke anymore because they're going to leave the pub and they're going to go to smoke, and you have to sit down in your table and you are left alone. So context wasn't always helpful for that process of giving up smoking. But indeed, it was helpful for them in their process of becoming non-smokers. So I ended up with this question: if the context is helpful or helped them to become non-smokers, but it didn't help them to give up smoking, or at least it didn't help everybody to give up smoking. So what was this context helping? What was the process that it was facilitating? If it wasn't giving up smoking, then what was the thing that it was facilitating? which led me to my aha moment number 2. What if giving up smoking and becoming a non-smoker are not the same thing? What if these are 2 different processes instead of one, as it is commonly assumed? What if giving up smoking is part of becoming a non-smoker, but there is more to it? And it is with that other stuff that the social context is very relevant. It's in regard to that other stuff that the social context is very relevant. So now I was facing the need to try to find out what that other stuff was. So what I decided to do was to look at it from the other end. So the way I was doing it was I was looking at my participants' stories of becoming non-smokers, the way they would tell me those stories. I started smoking, then something happened, then I became a non-smoker. And that's the way I was also analyzing their stories. But I thought it might be useful because I was finding it hard to analyze it in that way. I decided instead to do this thing that is called the flip-flop technique. You flip your concept around, you flip your story around, and you looked at it from the other end. So I wanted to look at what you are a non-smoker. You have become a non-smoker. What brought you here? I knew that part of it was giving up smoking, but I also knew that there was something in between giving up smoking and this being a non-smoker that was missing. So I wanted to find out what that was. And one necessary first step to do that was, okay, what is it to be a non-smoker? How do people experience their being non-smokers? And looking through the data, I found quotes like the one from James. He is just himself. He is a non-smoker, yes, indeed, but actually he is just himself. If he ever thinks about smoking, it is only when people ask him, like a GP asking him in an office consultation, did you ever smoke? And that's the only time he would think, yes, I used to smoke, but otherwise he's just himself, and being himself is how he is a non-smoker. And the same thing with Franco, for example, who told me the story of him noticing how he became a non-smoker. He told me, I realized I was a non-smoker in this one occasion. He was at a barbecue and someone offered him a cigarette. And he thought, I don't want to. Like, I can't find any reason to do it. I can't find any sense to do this thing. And it was at that stage that he realized, I'm a non-smoker now. And I think what Franco was describing here was the moment, not so much when he was deciding to reject that cigarette, but he was deciding to sustain this one thing that he was already doing effortlessly, this one thing that was coming natural to him, which was non-smoking. He was already a non-smoker. And it was only when faced with the opportunity to smoke that he realized, this is actually quite easy for me. I have been doing this for a long time that I cannot find any reason to change that. I am a non-smoker. So what I gathered from their accounts of what being a non-smoker was, I realized that being a non-smoker, for my participants at least, required no self-control. There was no need to exercise self-control in that being a non-smoker. For them, being a non-smoker was just effortless. It was just something that they took for granted, something that was just an expression of being themselves, and which I think makes sense. I looked back at my data and I realized there was probably something that I needed to emphasize. So I came up with these 2 terms that I know they're not very dissimilar one from the other. Not smoking versus non-smoking. And not smoking is what you do once you give up smoking. Once you stop smoking, you discontinue your consumption of tobacco, and you are indeed not smoking. But this absence of tobacco is felt. It's very present. It's a very present absence of tobacco. So you are struggling to sustain this discontinuation of your consumption of tobacco, and which is very different to what a non-smoker did or what they did when they were non-smokers, which is just non-smoking. They're not struggling to sustain that. They are just being themselves. So what I needed to find out then was how did one move from not smoking to non-smoking? And I came up with this quote from another participant, from Alex. He was describing his process of becoming a non-smoker here in New Zealand, and he said it was very natural. And he used this word, it felt less natural to smoke. And I thought that was quite interesting. So I decided to look at it using the way he described it. What if this process of becoming a non-smoker is one where smoking becomes less natural, while instead non-smoking becomes more natural? Non-smoking becomes this natural thing to do. So I came up with this term. The process of becoming a non-smoker is actually the process of naturalizing non-smoking. It is a movement away from that struggle to sustain the absence of tobacco to actually just sustaining that absence of tobacco by being yourself. It becomes a natural thing not to smoke. And looking back at all my participants' stories, these allowed me, this way of looking at it allowed me to explain all of their stories. Basically, this story was, in short, all participants came to New Zealand from a smoking milieu, which was a place where everybody smoked, where it was normal to smoke, and where most of their interactions were with smokers. And most of these participants found themselves, once they were in New Zealand, participating in non-smoking milieus, while others found themselves in smoking milieus. Those who found themselves in non-smoking milieus were able to both quit smoking and become non-smokers in that milieu. But those participants who found themselves first in a smoking milieu and gave up smoking while interacting with that smoking milieu needed then to shift to a non-smoking milieu in order to be able to become non-smokers. And what that context added to their process of becoming non-smokers was the facilitation of this other stuff, this naturalization of non-smoking. That was basically the short version of the theory. This is the longer version of the theory. I don't know how much sense this will make to everybody, but these are the categories and the subcategories that comprise the theory of naturalizing non-smoking. Trying to make it simple, the idea is that giving up smoking is part of the process of becoming a non-smoker, but it's not the whole thing. And you can give up smoking while participating both in a smoking milieu or in a non-smoking milieu. And it just involves this process of, and I didn't want to go too deep into that, it just involves this process of making the decision to give up smoking and the actual process of smoking cessation. That is something, like I said, that could happen either in a smoking or a non-smoking milieu. However, there are two other things that can only happen in a non-smoking milieu and that are necessary for someone to be able to naturalize non-smoking. The first of these two things is the normalization of non-smoking. Because here's the thing, non-smokers assume that non-smoking is normal, that it is the taken for granted behavior. It is something that you could expect from everybody else, unless they, and you can come up with whichever explanation you want to come up with, unless they grew up with a family who smoke, unless they are from this place, or unless they work in this place. It is in those situations that people might end up smoking. But if those situations are absent, people would normally just not smoke. And participants who were interacting with a non-smoking milieu were able to normalize non-smoking, were able to shift their perspective of smoking from that of smoking is something normal to actually smoking is something that only happens in certain contexts, which is actually the way in which they told me their own stories of previous smoking. I used to smoke because in the place where I come from, that was the case. But for them, while we were talking during these interviews, non-smoking was already the expectant thing. non-smoking was already the normal thing to do. They had already at that stage normalized non-smoking. The other thing you need to do, and that is facilitated by participating in a non-smoking milieu, is the possibility to socialize as a non-smoker. You need to be able to interact with others using non-smoking instead of smoking, because social interactions were quite relevant. In fact, they contributed a lot to previous failed attempts. When participants didn't have a chance to continue interacting with their friends as non-smokers, they shifted back to smoking. And it is this combination of these three processes, the normalization of non-smoking, the possibility of socializing as a non-smoker, plus of course giving up smoking, that leads to the naturalization of non-smoking. I don't want to go into too much detail, and I feel I have already gone into too much detail, because there is one concept that I want to emphasize, which is the one of naturalizing non-smoking. So let me come back to that one. So basically, this is the developed theory. Giving up smoking is part of the process of becoming a non-smoker, but it's not the whole story. What giving up smoking will do is it will lead you to not smoking. Yes, you will be discontinuing your consumption of tobacco, but you will be struggling to sustain that discontinuation. And if you are interacting mostly with other smokers, if you're in a context where there is a lot of smoking happening around you, it definitely won't feel like a liberation, and it will feel like a struggle. So you might not be able to naturalize non-smoking, and thus you will probably go back to just continuing to smoke. Because there is one thing that is also necessary for someone to become a non-smoker, which is the naturalization of non-smoking. And the naturalization of non-smoking requires, or is facilitated by one's interaction with a non-smoking milieu, with an environment that allows you to see non-smoking as the taken for granted thing, that allows you to see non-smoking as just the done thing, as something that people would just normally do. And a context that allows you to interact with others, to connect, to belong, to be part of a group without the need of using smoking to do so. You will be able to socialize as a non-smoker. And it is through that process that you are able to then, yes, like the name of the theory says, to naturalize non-smoking, so that non-smoking becomes just natural expression of who you are. You are non-smoking just because you are. So what the theory emphasizes then is that this process of becoming a non-smoker is a relational process, unlike how it is usually seen, which is as a very individual process, something that needs to be done by the individual. Often when we think about giving up smoking, we might think of a context, but we often emphasize other things like the importance of self-control, the importance of motivation, the importance of commitment. And these things might play an important role in making the decision and going through the process that is involved in giving up smoking. But unless you're able to naturalize non-smoking, you won't be able to become a non-smoker. And this naturalization of non-smoker is something that happens with others, in interaction with other people. It is a relational process. So we know that most smokers would like to give up smoking, would like to quit, and people are trying to do it. But unfortunately, the success rate of these quit attempts is very low. We also know that social context is very important to the process of giving up smoking, and that because that is something that is always brought up by people when asked, what was the thing that made it harder for you to succeed in your quit attempt? It will very often, if not always, will be the people around me. Everybody smoked, or my family smoked. We also know that a lot of the successful quit attempts happened out there in the world unaided. So there seems to be something that is happening outside of our scope that is happening organically. and that people are tapping into when they're trying to give up smoking. And we haven't yet touched on it. We haven't yet conceptualized what is it that is happening out there organically, and that people are finding on their own and succeeding because of finding it. And I think that the thing that people are finding on their own that is helping them to succeed in their quit attempts is the importance of connecting with non-smokers, of participating in a non-smoking milieu. And the thing that is making it hard for people to give up smoking is their participation in a smoking milieu, their interaction with people who smoke. But unfortunately, the things I think, and this is just an opinion, the thing that is preventing us from tapping on that which is happening out there organically is the way in which we're looking at the process right now, the theories that we're using to explain what is happening right now. And that's quite a relevant thing, because the theories we use, they frame the things that we see. They frame how we explain these things that we see, what will be outside of our scope, what we won't be paying attention to. So therefore, we won't be including into our explanations, or we won't include them in what we want to know through our further researches. They will also influence our practice, the advice that we will give to people when they ask us for suggestions on how to approach a quit attempt. And they also frame our responsibilities. And I think that current theories being used, or most of the theories that we're using to explain what is necessary for someone to give up smoking, are very focused on biological and psychological aspects, in something that Peter Adams called a particle perspective. It would be easy using these theories to talk about someone living in a vacuum. Using these theories, we don't necessarily need to see the person in context. We could just imagine an individual in a dark vacuum and explain the things that are necessary for this person to succeed in his or her quit attempt, or the things that will work against that. We are not necessarily always thinking that is impossible, and that doesn't happen. People living in social contexts, they live in relationships, they express themselves in these relationships, they define who they are in these relationships, and these connections that we have with others play a very important role in the things that we do and how we see ourselves. But by focusing everything into what is happening within the individual instead of within that person's context, we are leaving a lot of it out, which is unfortunate. So it might be necessary to not to leave those things outside, to take a critical review of the most common assumptions that we have, things that have become taken for granted, mostly because actually of the theories that we use to explain what is necessary to give up smoking. One of these things that we assume is that non-smoking is the natural expression of just being a human being. Non-smoking is our underlying natural state, which is something that we commonly assume, I think, because we have naturalized non-smoking ourselves, either because we never smoked or because we have gone through the process of becoming non-smokers. So from this end of the process, we looked at non-smoking thinking it is natural. It is just being yourself. And unless so-and-so happens. But it might not be the case that non-smoking is the natural expression of being oneself, but instead it is a social practice, much like smoking is a social practice, one that you learn to practice within a certain context that facilitates that practice. And you practice it enough to the point where it becomes natural to you. But by looking at non-smoking as if it was a very natural thing to do, a thing that human beings just do, we tend also to believe that all that is necessary for someone to become a non-smoker is just to give up smoking. All you need to do to become a non-smoker is just get rid of that cigarette, and you will fall back into this natural state. All that it takes for someone to become a non-smoker is just the absence of cigarettes, the absence of smoke. And once you get rid of that, you fall back into just being yourself, which is being a non-smoker. And there might be some effort in doing that, but you have to commit. And there is a lot of self-control required in the process. You need to be motivated to do so. But then again, there's another assumption that comes with this. We assume that if someone goes through all the process of disconnecting themselves from those meaningful relationships that they had that unfortunately were contributing to their smoking, that this person, isolated from that context, will be welcomed in other contexts. And that is not always the case. It is not always the case that someone who managed to non-use a drug is, like tobacco, is welcome into context of non-users. So if we continuously emphasize this need of self-control and motivation, assuming that all you need to do is just want to do it, and that everything else will fall into place, we might be assuming something that is not really happening outside in the real world. People are not necessarily always welcome into context of non-smokers, of context of non-users. And something else that contributes to that perception of all that you need to do is just commit and be motivated and you need willpower is this magic trick that we do, calling things stimulus or calling things triggers. It's almost like, and I have an image in my head that I would like to share with you. It's almost like having 3 plastic cups upside down on your table. And you put underneath one of these cups, let's say a packet of cigarettes, which could be a stimulus. You put underneath another of these plastic cups, a coffee, which is something you would normally do with smoking. And you put under your third cup a lifelong relationship with a friend, someone you grew up with and that had a lot to do in defining who you are right now. And we put it down that, and we call these 3 things stimulus. They are hidden underneath the cups, and we now perceive them as one and the same thing. They are stimulus, they are triggers. They are all equally, they are equivalents. While that is not necessarily the case always. It might be easier to get rid of an ashtray in your house than to get rid of a lifelong relationship or friendship. And by calling them both stimulus, I think we are misinterpreting the role that they play in our lives. So I didn't want to end up just with a theoretical discussion. So I tried to come up with potential practical suggestions that would come out of the theory of naturalizing non-smoking. And these are the ones that I came up with. When you're talking to people about giving up smoking, something that might be necessary is also to include in that discussion a conversation about non-smoking. You could ask the individual, how would it be to perform non-smoking? Can you see yourself doing that? How would it change the way you see yourself? How would it change the way you see others or others see you? How would it change your interaction with other people? Would you be able to sustain the performance of non-smoking in time and feel that you have achieved well-being? So including a conversation of non-smoking might be something useful, not only to focus on smoking and what is necessary to manage the potential withdrawal symptom that might come out of discontinuing its consumption, but also about non-smoking and how would it be like to engage in that shift from the practice of smoking to the practice of non-smoking. And also, if possible, to include others in the conversation, family, whānau, communities, couples, keeping in mind that people might not always be authoritative enough to make others change their behavior. So people might not always be able to say, we won't smoke in my house anymore. Or when we are together, we won't smoke anymore. And being mindful of that, to have a conversation that doesn't only focus on the individual, but also focus on that individual's context and meaningful relationships. And if there is no relationships that would allow a person to naturalize non-smoking, a discussion of how to deal with that and what would it mean to deal with that. And on a broader level, though, policies are very important, because in New Zealand, at least, these policies have, and the same in Australia, these policies have supported the development of what I call non-smoking milieus and the reproduction of non-smoking milieus. But one thing is their existence, and another thing is the possibility to participate in these environments, which, like I mentioned before, might not always be easy. So one thing that we need to take into account when we are developing policies, and when we're talking to people as well on an individual level, is a stigma and exclusion. Not to assume that just because you have given up smoking or just because you're not using anymore, that you will be welcome in a community of non-users or a community of non-smokers, because there might be some stigma that you will bring with you, or there might be some unfortunate level of exclusion that you might experience that might not make that experience one of a pleasurable one. So you might not be able to feel that you can belong to that community and fulfill your life in that community, both in the present and in the future. So with 10 minutes for an hour, I'll just leave it at that. And I want to say before finishing, which I'm doing with saying this, thank you, Renee, and thank you for the invitation for this presentation. And thank you for your presence here, everybody. I hope.
Thank you so much, Rama. That was just fabulous. I'm actually speaking to you. You can see a curtain behind me at a meeting of tobacco control people from around Australia, making policy on the very thing that you're describing and discussing. And I'm certainly going to go back to that meeting and say, look, I've just heard the most wonderful presentation. You saw me making lots of notes, and I did, and I've got lots of questions, but I'd certainly like to open it up. We only just have a few minutes to open up to the audience, who can use the Q&A icon if you have any questions, please. Please type in or speak. You can do either, I believe. Kevin, you might want to speak about this a little bit, we've got a Q&A question, and it might require you, Kevin, to read it.
We
have one question from Amy. Was there a similarity between methods of quitting used?
There were among a few. Most of my participants gave up smoking cold turkey. Only 2 of them used nicotine replacement therapy and medication, actually both. And the rest did it cold turkey. So that's a similarity, but not across all participants. I couldn't also say that they all did it immediately after making the decision to quit, because some took their time planning their quit attempt before actually discontinuing smoking. But there were some similarities in methods. Yeah, I guess there was not one method that was used by everybody. Not even in the way of going cold turkey. Some people kept their cigarettes, others got rid of theirs. Some people let others know that they were going to give up smoking so that they would know about it. Others didn't tell anybody because they thought that was going to be more helpful. And there was such a variety of things that I struggle a lot to try to see that common thing that was across all experiences, and actually I couldn't.
Thank you. David has said, how do you think this new model interacts with the traditional trans-theoretical model of change?
I think like I mentioned, I think giving up smoking is a very important part of the process of naturalizing non-smoking. But it is not the whole thing. So there are theories out there that focused on these biopsychological variables that have a lot to do with someone giving up smoking. And the trans-theoretical model of change is one of them. It tries to explain the process that is necessary for someone to go through discontinuation of smoking, but it stops there. And unfortunately, one thing that it does, because of its focus on biopsychological features, which it is explicit about it, is that it claims that the most important thing perhaps for someone to go through the whole process and end up at the end of the revolving door with the maintenance stage is commitment and or motivation, actually. And that puts the burden in the individual in this regard of the highly relevant influence of social context, which is unfortunate, I think, because if we were to use solely this theory to explain what happens when someone becomes a non-smoker, we might also end up disregarding the influential role of social context and not discussing it with our clients, which is something we should do, I think.
I'd like to ask you a question. I've got a few, actually. The timeline on this, from being from the initiation into this to the feeling of it's of no interest to me anymore. I feel I have the identity of a non-smoker now. What do you think the timeline was? It similar with people?
That was again something very interesting, because I was using, and I didn't emphasize this enough, I was using a constructivist grounded theory where that doesn't allow me, because of its epistemological assumptions, it doesn't allow me to make a claim of objectivity. So I regarded a successful quit attempt as one if the participants regarded it as one. So I had participants who considered they had gone through the process with just a month of distance between their quit attempts and our interview. And I had participants who had more than 20 years between their quit attempt and the time they felt and our interview. But how much time does it take?
Mm-hmm.
That was a question I didn't ask directly to my participants. And I think it will be highly dependent on the individual. I think actually the moment where but nevertheless, unfortunately, I'm not able to answer how much time it takes 2 weeks or a month or 3 weeks. But what does happen, for what I've seen, for what I've heard from my participants, is that it is almost imperceptible. It is a process that is going in the background. It's interesting that you use the term "develop the identity of a non-smoker," because in the way I see it, what is happening is actually people are able to perform non-smoking, and it is through this performance of non-smoking that they develop the identity of a non-smoker. It is an identity that is performatively constructed, rather than something that occurs first. It's not like they first change their self-label or the self-identity, the way they saw themselves, and thus adjusted their behaviors to that newly developed self-label. But rather because of, for most of them, because of migration, they found themselves performing this new practice to which they didn't have access before. And it was through that performance that this identity of a non-smoker congealed and came to existence. But actually, they wouldn't describe it like that. They would say, I was just being myself.
Mm. I always say to people, if you look at the relapse rates, which are prodigious when people first attempt to quit spontaneously, that's not getting any help. It's really terrible in the first 2 weeks, and then it sort of gets better, and people get better and better of learning how to behave. That's how I put it to them, without a cigarette. And by 3 months or so, 3 months, people have learnt the nuances of being, literally being, without smoking. And then I think it starts to sort of set in. But that's just sort of a little way I put it to our smoking patients, because the relapse rates really flatten out after about 3 months. So that by 3 months, you sort of worn into it a bit. Rama, I need to say goodbye to you because we're nearly at 1 hour, and so we need to finish up very quickly and say thank you again so very much. We hope to see many publications of this so we can cite it. Please, we need your publications very desperately. Let us know and we'll make that available to all our colleagues as well.
I will.
For those who are logging off, just letting you know that the next presentation on June the 25th at 12 o'clock, we'll be presenting, this is a webinar that will be video recorded so you can get access to it, and it will be by Professor Gary Egger, and this time myself as well, the two of us, on our project called Shared Medical Appointments for Smoking Cessation. A little bit like, can I say, he will be horrified if I tell him this is what I've called it. It's a bit like going to the doctors for a Weight Watchers program, but this is for program smoking cessation. So I'll be happy next time to present my work with Professor Gary Egger on shared medical appointments in smoking cessation, our pilot work on that. So again, thank you so very much, Rama, and let's see those publications. It would be great to see it soon. Thank you, everybody. Don't forget you can access Rama's video recording when we'll let you know how to do that soon. Cheers. Thanks, everybody, and goodbye.